this episode, we are pulling together everything covered in Domain 4 and turning it into a clear mental picture you can carry into your C-risk study and ultimately into the exam itself. Domain 4 can feel broad when you first encounter it because it brings together technology topics, security concepts, resilience ideas, data handling, development practices, and awareness responsibilities that all connect back to risk. For a brand new learner, that can make the domain seem like a long list of unrelated subjects, but it is much more unified than it first appears. The real purpose of this domain is to make sure you understand the technical and operational environment where risk actually lives. C-Risk is not asking you to become a system administrator or security engineer here. It is asking you to understand enough about core technology and security concepts to identify risk, ask better questions, connect controls to business needs, and recognize what matters when an organization is trying to reduce exposure and stay resilient. Before we continue, a quick note. This audio course is a companion to our Course Companion books. The first book is about the exam and provides detailed information on how to pass it best. The second book is a Kindle-only ebook that contains 1,000 flashcards that can be used on your mobile device or Kindle. Check them both out at cyberauthor.me in the Bare Metal Study Guide series. One of the biggest takeaways from Domain 4 is that technology risk is never only about technology. That may sound strange at first because this domain includes very technical-sounding topics, but the exam perspective is still rooted in business impact, governance, and risk decision-making. Disaster recovery, business continuity, data lifecycle management, privacy, development practices, awareness training, and security frameworks all matter because they shape whether the organization can keep operating safely and effectively. When you study this domain, do not fall into the trap of memorizing isolated terms without understanding why they matter to the business. A server failure matters because it affects a process people depend on. Weak access control matters because it can expose sensitive information or undermine trust. Poor recovery planning matters because the organization may not be able to restore critical services fast enough when disruption occurs. The exam often rewards the person who sees the business consequence behind the technical topic instead of focusing only on the technical label. Another major takeaway is that Domain 4 is about foundational understanding, not deep technical execution. You are expected to understand core concepts well enough to reason through risk scenarios, evaluate control effectiveness at a high level, and identify where exposure may exist. You are not expected to configure systems, write code, or perform hands-on engineering work in your head during the exam. This distinction matters because new learners sometimes overcomplicate their study approach by trying to master the detailed mechanics of every technology area. That is usually not the best use of time for C-Risk. Instead, you should know what a concept is, why it matters, what kind of risk it addresses, and how it connects to business continuity, security, privacy, or resilience. Think like a risk professional who works closely with technical and business teams, not like a specialist being tested on configuration detail. That mindset will help you stay focused on judgment, prioritization, and practical understanding rather than getting lost in unnecessary complexity. A very common pattern across Domain 4 is the idea of lifecycle thinking. Data has a life cycle, systems have a life cycle, security practices evolve over time, and even continuity and recovery capabilities have to be maintained rather than created once and forgotten. This matters because many risks appear not at the beginning of a process, but later, when information has been copied too many times, when systems have aged without enough review, or when recovery plans have gone stale because the business changed around them. A strong exam mindset is to ask yourself where something begins, how it changes over time, where it moves, who touches it, and how it eventually ends. If you can think in life cycle terms, you will better understand why retention matters, why disposal matters, why maintenance matters, and why outdated processes become risky even if they once worked well. Domain 4 repeatedly teaches that good risk management depends on sustained control and visibility across time, not just one-time setup. Disaster recovery and business continuity are two topics that students often confuse, so a strong review point is to keep their center of focus separate while still seeing how they relate. Disaster recovery management, DRM, is more concerned with restoring technology and data after a significant disruption, while business continuity management, BCM, is focused more broadly on keeping critical business operations going during and after disruption. On the exam, if a scenario is mainly about restoring systems, data, or technical infrastructure, you are usually closer to DRM thinking. If the scenario is about keeping essential services operating, using alternate methods, prioritizing critical business activities, or maintaining customer-facing capability under stress, you are usually closer to BCM thinking. That distinction helps a great deal because exam questions often test whether you understand the objective behind a control or plan. The exam does not usually reward vague thinking that blends everything into one giant continuity concept. It rewards clear reasoning about what problem the organization is actually trying to solve. The same kind of clear distinction helps with data lifecycle management and privacy. Data lifecycle management, DLM, focuses on managing data from creation to storage, use, sharing, retention, archive, and disposal, while privacy focuses more specifically on the fair, appropriate, transparent, and bounded handling of personal information. Protection sits alongside both of those ideas because sensitive data has to be secured wherever it exists and however it moves. On the exam, a question about how long information should be kept, how it should be classified, or what should happen when it is no longer needed is often testing lifecycle thinking. A question about whether information is being collected for a clear purpose, used appropriately, or handled in a way that respects expectations and obligations is often testing privacy thinking. These concepts overlap in the real world, but the exam often becomes easier when you ask yourself what the main issue is. Is the problem about managing the data across time? Or is it about whether the organization's use of the data is appropriate and controlled? The System Development Lifecycle, SDLC, is another area where the exam is usually testing judgment more than terminology. The biggest lesson from that topic is that risk should be considered early, consistently, and throughout the life of the system rather than only after deployment. If security, resilience, privacy, logging, recovery needs, or access control are treated as last-minute additions, the organization often ends up with more expensive fixes and weaker overall results. On exam questions, if you see a scenario where a system is being designed, built, tested, or changed, the stronger answer is often the one that integrates control thinking early rather than waiting until something goes wrong. You should also remember that SDLC is not only about coding. It includes planning, requirements, design, testing, implementation, maintenance, and retirement. For C-risk purposes, the most useful habit is to look for whether risk and control considerations are being built into the process in a deliberate, repeatable way rather than bolted on late. Emerging technology questions can create anxiety because they sound modern and uncertain, but the exam logic usually stays grounded in familiar risk principles. If the topic is artificial intelligence, AI, machine learning, ML, Internet of Things, IoT, cloud-native platforms, or another fast-moving technology area, the key is not to panic and assume you need specialist-level knowledge. Instead, look for the familiar questions underneath the new label. What business problem is the technology solving? What new dependencies does it create? What kind of confidentiality, integrity, availability, privacy, resilience, or third-party risk does it introduce? Who owns the risk? And how will the organization monitor whether the technology continues operating within acceptable boundaries? C-risk is usually not testing whether you can sound impressive about new technology. It is testing whether you can remain disciplined when evaluating unfamiliar tools and avoid being either blindly enthusiastic or automatically dismissive. Strong answers usually reflect governance, accountability, and continued assessment rather than hype. Frameworks and standards are another area where candidates sometimes study too mechanically. You do need to know the basic role of models such as NIST, ISO, and COBIT, but the more important exam takeaway is what these tools do for an organization. They provide structure, common language, baseline expectations, and a repeatable way to organize security and control work. A framework helps people talk about security and risk in a consistent way across teams and leadership levels. A standard gives more concrete expectations for acceptable practice. On the exam, you usually do not need to recite detailed clauses or formal documents from memory. What matters more is understanding that recognized frameworks support governance, consistency, and maturity, and that organizations use them to reduce random decision-making. If you get a question that asks what strengthens a program most, the better answer often involves creating a structured, recognized, repeatable approach rather than relying on isolated technical actions or informal local habits. Information security awareness training is another topic that can be misunderstood if you study it too narrowly. The exam is not likely to frame training as a yearly compliance checkbox and then reward that shallow view. A stronger C-risk perspective is that awareness training helps build a risk-aware culture by improving recognition, judgment, reporting, and safe day-to-day handling of information and systems. If a question asks what makes awareness effective, think about relevance, reinforcement, alignment to real organizational risk, role appropriateness, and support from leadership. If a scenario involves repeated human mistakes, insecure habits, or poor reporting culture, awareness training may be part of the answer, but it should usually be understood as one layer in a broader control environment rather than a magic fix for everything. The exam often prefers answers that show a realistic balance. People need to be informed and prepared, but systems and processes also need to be designed so that good behavior is supported instead of constantly depending on perfect human performance. Across the whole domain, one of the strongest study habits is to keep returning to confidentiality, integrity, and availability, CIA, as a lens. Many topics in Domain 4 can be understood more easily by asking which part of CIA is most directly threatened and what kind of control or practice helps protect it. Privacy issues often point strongly toward confidentiality, though they can affect integrity and trust as well. Disaster recovery and continuity planning often point strongly toward availability, though integrity of restored data also matters. Development practices, access control, and standards often support all three in different ways. Using CIA as a mental anchor can help you avoid getting lost in topic sprawl. It gives you a practical way to translate a technical-sounding concept into a risk perspective. When a question feels dense, pause and ask what kind of harm is most likely here. That often helps reveal why one answer is stronger than another. Another helpful exam tip is to prefer answers that show planning, governance, and prevention before answers that rely mainly on reaction. Domain 4 includes response and recovery concepts, but the C-risk mindset is still strongly biased towards structured, proactive management of risk. A good answer often includes classification before misuse, design review before deployment, awareness before error, recovery planning before disruption, and retention rules before data sprawl becomes unmanageable. That does not mean response is unimportant. It means the exam frequently rewards choices that reduce uncertainty and strengthen control earlier in the process. If two answers both sound reasonable, the stronger one is often the one that addresses root causes, creates repeatable process, or establishes accountability before the organization is already in trouble. This is especially true in questions that use words such as most effective, best first step, greatest reduction in risk, or most appropriate action from a governance or management perspective. You should also watch for distractors that are technically true, but not the best answer for a C-risk style question. One answer choice may describe a useful security action, but another may better reflect ownership, business alignment, or sustainable control. For example, a technical safeguard may help, but if the question is really about unclear accountability or missing governance, then the stronger answer will often address ownership or process first. The exam likes to test whether you can see beyond the surface of a problem. If a continuity issue exists because no one identified critical business services properly, then simply improving backups may not be the best answer. If a privacy problem exists because data is collected without clear purpose, then adding monitoring later may help, but may not address the root issue. Train yourself to look for the answer that is broader, more foundational, and more aligned with sound risk management rather than the answer that feels most operationally dramatic. A final study strategy for Domain 4 is to think in connected clusters rather than isolated chapter titles. Disaster recovery connects to resilience, recovery targets, and business impact. Business continuity connects to critical process prioritization, dependencies, communication, and alternate operating methods. Data lifecycle management connects to classification, retention, disposal, and privacy. SDLC connects to early risk consideration, control design, and change over time. Security frameworks and standards connect to governance, structure, and repeatability. Awareness training connects to culture, human behavior, and reporting. If you study each topic as a separate box, the domain can feel crowded and hard to retain. If you study them as related ways of controlling risk in the technology and information environment, they become much easier to remember and use. That is especially valuable on the exam, because scenario questions often cross topic boundaries and reward candidates who can connect ideas instead of treating each concept as a memorized island. As you wrap up Domain 4, the most important thing to remember is that this section of C-Risk is not asking you to become the deepest technical person in the room. It is asking you to understand the technology and security environment well enough to recognize where risk comes from, how foundational controls support the business, and why resilience depends on more than just technical tools. The key takeaways are that life cycle thinking matters, governance matters, business context matters, and good answers usually favor structured, proactive, and sustainable control over narrow or last-minute fixes. On the exam, stay calm, translate technical language into business impact, and look for the answer that best reflects risk-aware judgment rather than technical showmanship. If you approach Domain 4 that way, it becomes much more manageable, and you will be in a stronger position not only to answer review questions, but also to understand how this domain supports the larger C-Risk picture of identifying, assessing, responding to, and monitoring information and technology risk.
Thanks for listening. For more audio courses, daily newsletters, and more, please visit baremetalcyber.com.